The cargo bay of the C-17 Globemaster smelled like hydraulic fluid and old fear. Mara Slade sat alone in the red-lit darkness, her Macmillan TAC 338 laid across her knees like a sleeping animal. Her hands moved over it without instruction, without thought, the way a pianist's fingers find keys in the dark. Bolt carrier out. Firing pin assembly. Barrel check. Each component passing through her fingers and returning to its place in an order so deeply carved into muscle memory that her mind was somewhere else entirely. 14 hours ago, she had been sitting in a bar in Kentucky, reading a field manual. Someone had poured beer on it. She hadn't said anything. She had a plane to catch. The aircraft shuddered through turbulence somewhere over the Atlantic. Mara didn't pause. Her hands continued their ritual, each part inspected with the patience of someone who understood that a thousandth of an inch could be the difference between a successful shot and a dead operator. The barrel showed no copper fouling. The firing pin spring held correct tension. The scope's reticle was clean, sharp, perfectly centered. She reassembled the rifle in 47 seconds. Then she raised it toward the darkness at the far end of the cargo bay, found a shadow that was slightly darker than the others, and placed the crosshair on it. She pulled the trigger on the empty chamber. The click was very small and very precise in the silence of the aircraft. She lowered the rifle and closed her eyes. 14 hours ago, the sign above the door read Gaines's Tavern in letters that had been fading since 1987. Fort Caldwell, Kentucky. Thursday night. 21:30 hours. The kind of night that existed in the space between deployments, between wars, between the person you were before and whoever you were becoming. Mara Slade sat in this corner booth with her back to the wall and her face to the room, which was not a coincidence. The booth was scarred wood and cracked vinyl, the table surface mapped with ring stains from 1,000 Thursday nights exactly like this one. Her field manual lay open before her, pages dense with diagrams of overlapping fields of fire and mountainous terrain. Her left hand rested beside the book. Her index finger tapped a slow, quiet rhythm against the wood. Not to the music bleeding from the jukebox in the corner. She was counting. Exits. Potential threats. Improvised weapons. The geometry of a room she had been sitting in for 40 minutes and had already mapped completely because 6 years of carrying a cover that required her to be invisible had taught her that the moment you stopped mapping was the moment something found you unprepared. The logistics corps patch on her BDU caught the dim neon light from the beer signs. Supply specialist. 28 years old. 6 years of service. 0 deployments according to every record that existed at any clearance level below Tier 1. She turned a page and kept reading. The door opened. Mara's fingers stopped tapping. 4 men came through like weather. She clocked them in the time it took to draw a breath. The one in front was 6 feet and change, moving with the weight-forward confidence of someone accustomed to being the largest threat in any given space. Bronze Star, 18 months Kandahar. Back 3 days. The second man held her 3 o'clock position without intending to, the way trained soldiers unconsciously establish tactical geometry even when they're off duty. The third man favored his right side in a way that suggested old damage rather than current injury. The fourth, the youngest, positioned himself behind her without realizing that putting yourself at 6 o'clock behind a potentially dangerous person was the worst tactical decision available. She had read all 4 of them before they reached the bar. Staff Sergeant Colt Hargrove, Specialist Beckett Ashford, Corporal Dale Pruitt, Private First Class Rafferty Voss. She returned to her field manual and finished the paragraph she had been reading. Colt's voice cut through the country music from 10 feet away. "Hey." The word landed like something thrown. "Warehouse girl." Mara read to the end of the line, set her finger on the page to hold her place. Then she looked up. She gave him nothing. Not fear, not anger, not the particular kind of careful blankness that people showed when they were frightened but trying not to show it. She looked at him the way she looked at terrain features through a scope. Assessment. Information. No emotion attached to the data. "Can I help you, Sergeant?" Colt moved toward her with the slow certainty of a man who had spent 18 months in a place where slowness meant control and control meant survival, and who had carried that lesson home without understanding that it applied differently in a bar in Kentucky on a Thursday night. Curious what a supply clerk is doing reading infantry tactics. He stopped at the edge of her table. The smell of celebration came with him, beer and brotherhood, and the particular looseness of men who had been wound tight for a very long time and were finally violently unwinding. "You lost," Beckett laughed from the bar. Dale added something darker from her 9 o'clock. Rafferty stayed behind her young enough to believe that position was clever. Mara did not look away from Colt. "The manual is available to all soldiers, Sergeant Hargrove. I'm exercising my right to professional development." The use of his name created a ripple of silence. His eyes narrowed. "How do you know my name?" "I know all your names." She kept her voice at the same quiet level she always used, the kind of quiet that made people lean in rather than step back. "Staff Sergeant Colt Hargrove, 2 Bronze Stars, 75th Ranger Regiment, 2nd Battalion. You returned from Kandahar 3 days ago after an 18-month deployment. You were assigned to FOB Scorpion, primarily convoy security and quick reaction force duties." The tavern had developed a particular stillness. Conversations at nearby tables had not stopped, but they had quieted the way sounds quiet when something interesting begins to happen nearby. Colt's jaw tightened. "You've been stalking me, Supply. I read the deployment rosters. It's my job to know which units need which equipment when they return." Her finger traced the edge of her beer glass, leaving a trail in the condensation. "Specialist Beckett Ashford, Expert Marksman Badge, 3 deployments, Corporal Dale Pruitt, Purple Heart recipient, injured by IED in Kandahar Province, 14 months medical recovery, Private First Class Rafferty Voss, graduated Ranger School 7 weeks ago." The accuracy of it hit them physically. Beckett straightened from his casual lean. Dale shifted his weight and then caught himself shifting, which was worse. Rafferty's hand moved toward his pocket before he stopped it. Roy Gaines, 72 years old and built like someone who had spent decades absorbing the weight of other people's problems, watched from behind the bar with the patient eyes of a man who had been running this place long enough to recognize the precise shape of moments that could go several different ways. Walter Pruitt sat in the far corner with a glass of something amber, watching Mara with an expression that was different from everyone else's. Where the others looked surprised, Walter looked like a man who had just confirmed a suspicion. Colt put both hands on her table and leaned. "Knowing names doesn't make you a soldier. You ever been in a firefight? You ever calculated bullet drop while someone was actively trying to kill you?" "No, Sergeant, I have not." "Then what makes you think you understand tactics?" Mara picked up her beer, took a measured sip, set it down in precisely the same spot, the wet ring matching the existing circle on the wood. "I never claimed to understand tactics better than you. I claimed I was reading a manual. Those are different things." Beckett grabbed a napkin from the neighboring table and sketched quickly the movements of someone who had drawn weapon configurations 1,000 times. He dropped it in front of her. "You're such an expert. Tell me what's wrong with this setup." Mara glanced at the drawing for 3 seconds. 7 things. She didn't touch the napkin. "The barrel length is incompatible with that stock configuration. The scope mounting position would interfere with the charging handle. The trigger assembly is too far forward for standard hand placement. The magazine well angle is wrong for that lower receiver. The forward assist is on the wrong side for right-handed operation. The ejection port would send brass directly into the operator's face. And you've drawn a left-handed weapon system with right-handed controls." Silence. Beckett stared at his drawing. "Would you like me to correct it?" Dale's face darkened. "Anyone can memorize specs. Let's see you answer something real. What's the bullet drop on a .338 Lapua Magnum at 800 yards with a 10-mile-per-hour crosswind at 45 degrees? Assuming sea-level standard atmospheric pressure, 200 grain bullet muzzle velocity of 3,000 feet per second, you're looking at approximately 93 inches of drop and 17 inches of wind drift." Mara's response arrived without a pause. "But at Fort Caldwell's elevation, with typical November humidity, it's closer to 91 inches drop and 16 inches drift. Of course, that assumes consistent shooting position, which based on your current stance seems unlikely." The air in Gaines's tavern shifted. Dale had been unconsciously checking his right hip every time he changed his weight. He stopped doing it. Beckett had been favoring his left shoulder for the past several minutes, the micro-adjustments in his posture compensating for something that had been healing for a long time. He stopped compensating and stood very still instead, as if stillness might retroactively erase what she had already observed. Mara set down her beer. "Specialist Ashford has been favoring his left shoulder for the past 10 minutes. Rotator cuff, probably from improper form during physical training. The compensation pattern cost you approximately 3/10 of a second on target acquisition. She let that settle for exactly a moment. Corporal Pruitt has been checking his right hip each time he shifts weight. Old injury, shrapnel based on the movement pattern. She looked at Rafferty. Private Voss has hand tremors from dehydration and excess caffeine. His accuracy on the range tomorrow will be off by at least 15%. Then she looked at Colt. And you, Sergeant Hargrove, have been standing in a modified isosceles stance since you approached my table, which means you're carrying concealed at the 4 o'clock position, Glock 19 based on the printing pattern under your shirt. Colt's hand moved. It was involuntary, a twitch toward his concealed carry position, and it confirmed every word before he could stop it. In the corner, Walter Pruitt set down his glass very quietly. "There's something not right about this girl," he said to no one in particular. "Look at her eyes. Those aren't the eyes of someone who counts boxes." Colt heard it. He spread his arms wide in a gesture that was probably meant to be dismissive. "What? You think she's dangerous, old-timer?" Walter didn't answer. He just watched. Colt stepped back from the table. "Come on then, Supply. Show us what book learning taught you about combat." Mara looked at him. The look was level and very old, like something that had been worn smooth by exposure to things most people never encountered. "I don't engage in pointless violence, Sergeant. It's unprofessional and counterproductive." Counterproductive. Beckett repeated the word like it was something foreign. No instinct, no fire, no warrior spirit. Warrior spirit? Mara let the phrase sit between them for a moment. "Tell me, Specialist Ashford, how many confirmed kills do you have?" Beckett's chest expanded slightly. The automatic pride of a man who wore his count like a second uniform. 12 confirmed, maybe 20 probable. 12. Respectable for 3 deployments? She nodded slowly. "And how many firefights where you were outnumbered more than 10-1? What does that warrior spirit, as you call it, isn't about starting fights in bars with people you perceive as weaker?" Her voice remained at that same quiet level, the kind that required effort to hear and therefore required effort to ignore. "It's about maintaining absolute calm when 300 enemy combatants are trying to overrun your position and you're down to your last magazine," Rafferty scoffed. "And you'd know that from your experience in the supply depot." Mara looked at each of the 4 men in turn. Something moved in her expression, something old and patient and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Hypothetically," she said, "if someone had been in that situation, they probably wouldn't talk about it in a bar. They probably wouldn't need to prove themselves to anyone. They'd probably just sit quietly, study their manuals, and let insecure people make assumptions." Rafferty Voss had been at Ranger School 7 weeks ago. He still had something to prove, and the problem with having something to prove is that it made you reach for the nearest available proof. He reached for Mara's field manual and upended her beer over its open pages. The amber liquid spread across the tactical diagrams in a slow tide, soaking into months of careful margin notes, destroying the particular knowledge she had built and annotated and made her own. Rafferty watched it happen with the expression of someone who had just done something he believed was clever. Mara did not move for 3 seconds. She watched the beer soak into the pages. Her hands remained flat on the table. Her breathing did not change. When she finally reached out, it was to close the manual with careful movements, each edge aligned precisely, and set it on the table beside her drink. That manual cost $87. Her voice was exactly the same as it had always been. Colt reached out and closed his hand around her wrist before she could stand. His grip was tight enough to leave marks, and she let him see that she noticed this, and she let him see that it didn't frighten her, and the combination of those 2 things should have told him something. At the edge of her sleeve, a thin white scar caught the neon light, a pale line against her skin, precise and old, the kind of scar that came from something specific and intentional rather than accidental. Colt didn't understand what he was seeing. But Walter Pruitt across the room went very still. "I strongly suggest you release my arm, Sergeant Hargrove." Her voice had dropped half an octave. "Not anger. Something colder than anger and more precise. Before this escalates beyond your ability to manage. You're going to file a complaint with Supply Command." He tightened his grip. From somewhere near the entrance, a voice that had not been present a moment ago said, "Specialist Slade." The room changed. It was the quality of the voice. It carried the particular authority of someone who had been exercising command for so long that it had become atmospheric, something you breathed rather than heard. It came from a man in civilian clothes near the door, a ball cap pulled low, who had not been there and then was. Colonel Nathan Briggs had the bearing of a man who had sent people into very dark places and waited with absolute patience to see who came back. He was looking at Mara with the focused attention of someone conducting an observation rather than ending a confrontation. Colt released her wrist. He turned. Recognition moved through him slowly, fighting the alcohol and the pride to get there. "Sir, Colonel Briggs, Sergeant Hargrove." The acknowledgement was minimal, a single degree of attention and nothing more. Briggs kept his eyes on Mara. "You have 20 minutes. Mara stood. She tucked the ruined field manual under her arm and moved toward the door, passing the 4 rangers the way she would move past furniture in a familiar room without acknowledgement, without hesitation. At the door she paused. She looked back at Colt. "For what it's worth, Sergeant, I hope your celebration is everything you earned. You survived 18 months in a combat zone. That's no small thing." A pause. "But survival and understanding are different achievements." Then she was gone. Colt stared at the door. The beer on his uniform had started to dry. The ruined manual was gone with her. His team stood around him in the particular silence of men who were beginning to realize that something had just happened that they didn't fully understand yet. Walter Pruitt raised his glass toward the empty doorway. He didn't say anything. He just raised his glass. Roy Gaines resumed polishing the bar. Briggs drove without explaining. The Kentucky night moved past the windows in pieces, dark hills and darker trees, and the scattered lights of a base that was always awake even when most of it was sleeping. Mara spent the first 3 minutes of the drive with the tablet he had handed her, her fingers measuring distances on the satellite imagery, calculating angles. "You let them humiliate you," Briggs said finally. "I was watching them." She didn't look up from the tablet. "You learn more about a person's character in the moments they believe they have power over someone powerless." "And what did you learn?" Her finger traced a ridgeline on the map. "Hargrove is a good soldier who makes poor decisions when he's performing for his team. Ashford has genuine tactical intelligence but limited emotional discipline. Pruitt carries anger from his injury that manifests as cruelty. And Voss is young enough to still be shaped." She paused. "Or broken, depending on who does the shaping." Briggs pulled into the secured facility on the far side of Fort Caldwell. The building was unremarkable by design. "The general is waiting." The briefing room was small and windowless. General Howard Steck appeared on the screen with the weight of too many funerals behind his eyes, 3 stars on his collar, and the particular economy of movement that belonged to men who had learned to conserve everything. While Steck talked, Mara stood at the tactical table with the satellite imagery spread before her and her hands moving, fingers measuring, marking positions, calculating fields of fire. She processed the briefing the way she processed everything, by converting words into geometry, into distance and elevation and wind. 48 Rangers. 3rd Battalion, Helmand Province. A patrol route that intelligence had cleared and that had not been clear. An ambush by 200 Taliban fighters in prepared positions. 17 dead, 14 wounded. The remainder holding a former police compound with 15% of their original ammunition. 2 Apache helicopters down. The nearest quick reaction force 6 hours out due to weather. Dawn in 90 minutes local time. Mara's fingers stopped moving. "Current spotter availability," she said. "Aaron Taft is wheels up from Fort Bragg. His ETA puts him 4 hours behind you." The math was immediate and did not require contemplation. She would go alone. She had gone alone before, though not at these odds, not at this ratio of 1 to 200. "What's the commanding officer's name?" she said. It was not quite a question. Steck checked his notes. "Captain Eli Hargrove." The universe had a sense of humor. Mara filed the information in the part of her mind where operationally relevant ironies were stored and processed later when there was time for processing. "Understood." She straightened from the table. "I need my kit ready in 30 minutes and air transport to forward staging at Bagram. Authorization to engage at will." "Already arranged." She moved toward the door. "Phantom 6. Steck's voice stopped her. "I'm not going to pretend this is anything but a mission with impossible odds. If you want to decline, I don't." The Armory's classified section existed in the space between official records. Tanner Krebs had been running it for longer than most of the operators he served had been in the military. He was 61 years old with the hands of a craftsman and the eyes of someone who had seen too many good people leave through that door and learned to count them carefully when they came back. Mara's Macmillan TAC 338 was already on the prep table, cleaned and zeroed. She geared up in silence. The field strip she had already performed on the aircraft was repeated now with access to proper lighting, and her full kit, every component inspected with the precision of someone whose life depended on mechanical perfection, at moments when there was no time to discover imperfection. 400 rounds of .338 Lapua Magnum arranged in organized rows. Ghillie suit custom-tailored for Afghan terrain designed to make her invisible against rock and sand, and the thermal signatures that drone optics were built to find. Thermal optics. Night vision. Encrypted communications. She pulled the ghillie suit on in a specific sequence, each layer in its designated order. Her left hand pulled the right shoulder strap, and she felt the resistance there, a tightness in the joint that had not been there this morning. She filed it away. "Suicide run," Krebs said. He was not trying to dissuade her. He was noting a fact. 200 targets, 1 operator. She checked the scope alignment against the laser calibration system. Perfect. Sounds like Tuesday. Those Rangers you're going to save, they know what you're doing for them. They don't know anything about me. She slung the rifle across her back. The weight of 70 pounds of gear settled onto her frame with the familiar comfort of something that had been carried so many times it had shaped itself to her. That's how it should be. She walked toward the waiting helicopter. Behind her, Krebs was already preparing the next equipment check with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the work continued regardless of outcomes. Back at the barracks, Colt Hargrove sat on his bunk and could not sleep. He had pulled up the Fort Caldwell personnel database with his CAC card and found what he expected to find. Specialist. 6 years service. MOS 92Y Unit Supply Specialist. Current assignment, Fort Caldwell Logistics Company. Deployment history 0. Commendations none listed. At the bottom of the file in text smaller than the rest, a single line. Clearance level classified. Tier 1 access required. Beckett was leaning over his shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "That's higher than ours," Beckett said. "That's special operations level." Colt tried to dig deeper. Every link returned the same 2 words in red letters. Access denied. He tried different databases, different approaches, getting more reckless as the alcohol burned off and something colder replaced it. He found one fragment before the system locked him out. Slade M. Specialist. Secondary assignment Phantom Program. Details classified beyond current access level. Beckett read it twice. "Anyone ever heard of the Phantom Program?" 3 heads shook. Colt's phone rang. Unknown number, international prefix. He answered it with a sense of dread that he couldn't locate or explain. "Sergeant Hargrove." The voice was formal and carried the weight of stars. "This is General Howard Steck, Joint Special Operations Command. I need to speak with you about your brother." The room tilted. Eli. His brother Eli, who had gone to Afghanistan 6 months ago with 3rd Battalion, who called home every Sunday when communications allowed, who had a daughter named Grace, who was 3 years old and had her father's eyes. Is he alive? As of 20 minutes ago, yes. His unit was ambushed in Helmand province 4 hours ago. They're currently surrounded and fighting for survival. We have deployed our best available asset to provide overwatch and delay the assault until the quick reaction force can reach them. What asset? Phantom 6. Colt's brain made the connection before the rest of him was ready for it. "Sir?" His voice had gone somewhere quiet and flat. "Is that Mara Slade?" A pause. "You know her, Sergeant?" Colt looked at the beer stain on his sleeve. He thought about the ruined field manual. He thought about his hand on her wrist and the white scar at the edge of her sleeve that he hadn't understood. "Sir, I met her tonight. We had an encounter at a local bar." He stopped. There was no version of this that sounded like anything other than what it was. "We humiliated her, mocked her knowledge, destroyed her property. I grabbed her wrist to stop her from leaving." A silence that lasted several seconds. "Sergeant Hargrove, what did she do when you humiliated her?" Colt closed his eyes. Nothing, sir. She paid for the damage manual and tried to leave. Then Colonel Briggs arrived and took her away. I see. Another pause longer. I'm going to tell you something that will stay between us. Phantom 6 requested to deploy without her spotter. That's against protocol. Operators only do that when they understand the odds are unsurvivable and they're going anyway. A pause. She volunteered for this mission knowing she might not come back. And she did it after your team treated her the way you described. In the corner of the room, Rafferty Voss was sitting on his bunk with his hands in his lap, looking at them as though they belonged to someone else. The hands that had poured beer over a field manual while a woman was quietly preparing to fly into a war zone and die for strangers. Colt pressed the phone against his ear and felt the weight of something that could not be undone settling into the bones of him. Sir, is there anything we can do? No, Sergeant, you're 8,000 miles away. What you can do is understand what kind of warrior you treated like a warehouse clerk tonight. The general's voice was quiet and very precise. And then you can spend the rest of your career making sure you never make that mistake again. The line went dead. The 4 Rangers sat in the silence of the barracks. Outside, Fort Caldwell was going about the business of a Thursday night. Inside, something had changed that would not change back. Beckett looked at the blank screen of Colt's phone. How many enemy fighters? 200. Colt's voice was hollow in a way none of them had heard before. The general said 200, and she's going alone. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Rafferty Voss stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the Kentucky dark, and his face had the expression of someone who had just understood for the first time what they had actually done. 8,000 miles away, a C-17 Globemaster climbed through the night over the Atlantic, carrying one woman toward a valley where 48 Americans were counting the minutes until dawn. Mara Slade sat in the red-lit cargo bay, with her rifle across her knees and her eyes closed. The mission brief was memorized. The terrain was mapped. The enemy positions were cataloged and prioritized. Her lips moved silently in the dark. Wind, elevation, distance, time to go to work. The Black Hawk came in low over the Helmand Valley with its running lights off, and its crew chief watching the ridgelines through night vision that turned the Afghan darkness into a green and gray world of sharp edges and deep shadows. Mara sat at the open door with her legs hanging over nothing and studied the terrain below with the focused attention of someone reading a document they needed to memorize completely before it was taken away. The satellite imagery she had spent 6 hours absorbing on the flight from Bagram was being confirmed and corrected in real time. Ridgelines were steeper than the map suggested. The valley floor was wider. The compound where 48 Americans were holding their ground showed as a cluster of faint lights through her night vision, small and isolated in the center of a darkness that was full of movement. The pilot's voice came through her headset. Best I can do is 2 clicks from the compound. Anti-aircraft activity is heavy along the direct approach. There's a ridgeline to the east that gives you elevation and cover. That ridgeline, she had already identified it on the imagery, a natural spine of rock running roughly north to south, rising 400 meters above the valley floor. Eastern exposure, clear sight lines to the compound and to every approach route the enemy would use. Drop me at the northern end. Copy. 2 minutes. She ran through the final check with movements that required no conscious direction. Rifle slung tight across her back. Spare magazines in designated pockets, priority order closest to the draw position. Ghillie suit sealed at every opening. Communications gear tested and confirmed. The wound on her left shoulder from the earlier drone engagement was bandaged and tight under the suit, a dull throb that she had categorized and set aside. It would matter later. It did not matter now. The crew chief gave her the signal. Mara stepped into the dark and fell. 23 seconds of silence, so complete it felt like a different world. No engine noise, no rotor wash, just the whisper of cold air moving past her at terminal velocity, and the distant sound of automatic weapons fire rising from the valley below, small and far away and urgent. The muzzle flashes looked like scattered sparks from up here, like something almost beautiful. She pulled the chute at the precise moment her altimeter indicated, felt the black canopy deploy above her with a sharp and familiar jolt, and spent the remaining descent calculating the wind correction needed to place her within 20 meters of her intended landing point. She landed on a flat section of rock, absorbed the impact through bent knees and practiced motion, and had the chute collapsed and buried under loose stones in 90 seconds. Then she moved. The position she had selected from the satellite imagery was better in reality than it had looked on the screen. A natural formation of boulders near the highest point of the ridgeline created a hide that offered 270 degrees of observation while presenting nothing visible from below. She was above and behind the primary enemy positions. She could see the compound clearly. She could see every approach route into the valley. They could not see her. She set up the rifle with the intimacy of long familiarity. Each component of the process performed in a specific sequence that had been repeated thousands of times across a decade of training and 23 previous operational deployments. Bipod deployed and adjusted for the angle of the rock surface. A single strand of fine thread tied to the barrel end angled into the night wind, giving her a continuous read on velocity and direction. Spare magazines arranged in order along the rock to her right, closest first. Thermal optic engaged the valley, blooming into a world of heat signatures. She counted. It took 4 minutes to complete a full sector-by-sector assessment of the enemy positions. The patience required for this kind of counting was not the patience of waiting. It was the patience of precision, the understanding that a number confirmed was worth more than a number estimated. 187 fighters. 6 primary positions, each anchored by crew-served weapons. A PKM machine gun team on a ridge to the north with clear fields of fire across the compound's main gate. 2 RPG teams positioned to cover the eastern and western walls. A technical with a DSHK heavy machine gun maneuvering toward a firing position that would give it enfilade coverage of the entire compound. A mortar team setting up at a distance that would allow indirect fire over the compound's walls. And the command element visible as a cluster of heat signatures near the southern approach, organized and deliberate. The Rangers inside that compound were already inside a killing box. They just hadn't been killed yet. She keyed her radio. Dagger 6, this is Phantom 6. I am on station. Authenticate. The response came back fast and tight, compressed by stress into something harder than a normal voice. Phantom 6, Dagger 6, actual. Authentication, Bravo. Tango 47. Who are you and where is our air support? She recognized something in that voice immediately. The cadence, the particular quality of authority being exercised at its outer limits. Captain Eli Hargrove sounded like his brother the way a rifle sounded like its twin. Same mechanism, different wear patterns. I am your air support captain. Keep your people below the parapet and mark your position with IR strobes. I'm about to go to work. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to contain disbelief. How many shooters do you have? Just me. A longer pause. Copy Phantom 6. Be advised. Enemy is consolidating for final assault. We estimate 30 minutes before they push. Ammunition is critical. Then I'll give you 31 minutes, Captain. Phantom 6 out. She settled behind the scope. The Taliban commander stood in the center of his command element, a tall man in a distinctive dark pakol hat, holding a radio handset, and gesturing toward the compound with the unhurried confidence of someone who had already written the outcome of this engagement and was simply waiting for reality to catch up to his assessment. He had positioned his forces well. The fields of fire were interlocking. The Rangers had no air support and diminishing ammunition. Dawn was coming, and with it the light that would make the final assault straightforward. Mara did not shoot him. She aimed at the radio in his hand. Range 2,134 meters. Elevation difference 340 meters, shooting downward requiring a specific compensation in her ballistic calculation. Wind 9 knots from the northwest gusting to 12. Temperature 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity 22%. Flight time at this range 2.8 seconds. She found the pause between heartbeats where the world went perfectly still. The rifle fired. The suppressor reduced the sound to a sharp crack that echoed off 3 different ridgelines, simultaneously making it impossible to locate by ear alone. 2.8 seconds later, the radio in the commander's hand disintegrated. He dropped the pieces and stared at his empty hand. His men scattered, firing into the darkness in half a dozen directions, calling out positions that did not exist. Mara had already cycled the bolt and moved her aim to the second priority target. The PKM team on the northern ridge was still setting up, still running the ammunition belt through the feed tray, still 60 seconds from being ready to fire. She did not shoot either of the two men. She shot the tritium sight on the PKM itself, a small, glowing rectangle visible through the thermal optic. The round struck the sight dead center and destroyed it. The gunner recoiled from the weapon and began examining it in the darkness with increasingly urgent hands, unable to understand what had happened or where the damage had come from. Third shot. The RPG gunner on the eastern approach was preparing to fire at the compound's wall. Through the thermal optic, she could see the heat signature of the warhead already loaded and armed. She did not shoot the man. She shot the warhead. The explosion lit the valley floor in a pulse of orange light that lasted 3 seconds. Mara used those 3 seconds to count additional targets made visible by the illumination. In the shockwave's aftermath, 3 men were down and not moving. 4 more had been knocked from their feet. The RPG position had ceased to exist. The fourth shot destroyed the DSHK Technical's engine block just as the vehicle cleared the last piece of terrain cover between its start position and its firing position. Steam erupted from the destroyed radiator in a column visible through the thermal optic. The gunner attempted to dismount and continue on foot. Mara's fifth shot stopped that. Inside the compound, Captain Eli Hargrove pressed himself against a crumbling mud wall with 47 Rangers who had been fighting for their lives for the past 4 hours and had stopped expecting rescue an hour ago. His uniform was caked with a mixture of dust and blood that he had stopped distinguishing between. The ammunition pouch on his vest contained 31 rounds. The man next to him had 17. His radio crackled. Dagger 6, there is an RPG team approaching your eastern wall. 4 personnel. Recommend you collapse your eastern perimeter by 5 meters immediately. Eli did not ask how a single shooter 2 kilometers away could see a 4-man team moving through broken terrain in complete darkness. He gave the order. His Rangers pulled back 5 meters from the eastern wall. 15 seconds later, 4 RPG rounds impacted the position they had just vacated. Sergeant First Class Aldridge, his senior NCO, crawled to his side with eyes that had processed too many impossible things in the past 4 hours and were running out of room for more. Sir, one person is doing all of that. That's what she says. Aldridge looked at the chaos erupting across the enemy positions. Fires where vehicles had been. Confusion where coordination had been. Sir, I've been in this business for 18 years. I've never seen anything like this. Neither have I. Eli keyed his radio. Phantom 6 Dagger 6. Status. Engaging. A pause. Captain, the mortar team at grid 374892. Do you have any rounds remaining? 2 rounds, total. Save 1. I'll tell you when. The thermal drone appeared on her scope at the 40-minute mark. It was not the heat signature of a bird or a piece of debris. The shape was wrong and the movement was too precise, a systematic grid search of the ridgeline conducted with the patience of a programmed algorithm rather than the intuition of a human observer. Someone had deployed military-grade surveillance equipment to locate her position. This was not a Taliban unit that had stumbled into an ambush. Mara processed the implications in approximately 4 seconds and set them aside. The tactical problem was immediate and specific. The drone was conducting a grid search and would reach her sector in 90 seconds. She had one option that did not involve abandoning the overwatch position entirely, and that option required her to fire and accept the consequences. She shifted aim to the drone, a small target at 400 meters moving at a predictable speed on a predictable heading. The shot was not difficult. She took it. The drone fell. The muzzle flash from her suppressed rifle was brief and small, but at this range and in this darkness, brief and small was sufficient. The enemy had been searching for her. Now they had a vector. The first rounds began hitting the rocks around her position 11 seconds after she fired. Not accurate. Suppressive fire aimed at a general area rather than a specific target. But suppressive fire into a confined ridgeline position was dangerous regardless of its accuracy, and the volume was increasing as more fighters oriented on the same vector. A fragment of rock, not a bullet, caught her left shoulder where the earlier bandage covered the drone fragment wound. The impact was sharp and immediate, and she felt the bandage shift and the dressing beneath it compress painfully against the wound. She did not stop. She had the rifle slung across her back, and was already moving her body low against the rock surface, angling north along the ridgeline, away from the position that was now being systematically destroyed by automatic weapons fire. 400 meters. The terrain was broken and dark, and she covered it in 87 seconds, moving fast enough to create risk and accepting that risk as the more favorable option compared to remaining stationary. She found the alternate position she had identified during her initial survey, a cluster of boulders that offered a different angle on the valley and protection from the direction the fire was currently coming from. She set up the rifle again, left shoulder aching with a steadiness that told her the wound had reopened. She tore a strip from the ghillie suit with her right hand and packed it against the shoulder through the fabric, pressing hard for 15 seconds, then continued setting up without stopping. The pain was information. She categorized it and filed it. Total time off scope 4 minutes 23 seconds. She keyed her radio. Dagger 6, position change, stand by. Eli's voice came back immediately. Phantom 6, are you hit? Standing by, Captain. She settled behind the scope. The enemy commander had regrouped his men at the base of the ridgeline and was organizing a sweep team, 40 fighters, moving in dispersed formation toward the position she had just vacated. Professional spacing. Good use of terrain. They would reach her old hide in approximately 8 minutes. She placed the thermal decoy with her left hand while her right eye stayed at the scope, a small device that emitted a heat signature consistent with a resting human body. She set it at the edge of her old position where it would be visible from the sweep team's approach angle. Then she waited. It took 6 minutes. The sweep team reached the old position and found the decoy and did what 40 men who had been frightened and confused for the past hour naturally did when they finally found what they were looking for. They converged. Mara keyed her radio. Dagger 6, grid 374892. Fire your remaining mortar round. Now. Phantom 6, that's our last. Now, Captain. The 60mm mortar round arced through the pre-dawn darkness with the slow grace of something that did not know what it was about to do. Mara watched it through the thermal optic, a brief streak of heat that ended in an expansion of light and force at the precise center of 40 concentrated men. The results were immediate and devastating. 18 killed, 14 wounded severely enough to require assistance. The remaining 8 men of the sweep team fled in different directions with the uncoordinated speed of people who had decided that organized withdrawal was a concept that applied to other situations. Good effect on target, Mara reported. You have 1 mortar round remaining. Do not use it without my instruction. Eli was quiet for a moment. How did you know they would bunch up? Because frightened men who find what they're looking for stop thinking tactically and start thinking emotionally. It's a consistent pattern. She was already scanning the valley for the next priority target. Captain, your brother, is his name Colt? The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Yes, Eli said carefully. You know him. We met last night. She put her eye back to the scope. He sends his regards. At Fort Caldwell, the night had gone gray at the edges, in the way that preceded dawn, the darkness becoming less certain of itself, the shapes of buildings emerging from it with reluctant clarity. Colt Hargrove had not slept. He sat at the window of the day room with a cup of coffee that had been cold for an hour and watched the base wake up around him. Beckett was cleaning his rifle, the same rifle he cleaned every night, the action he performed when his hands needed something certain to do. Dale sat with a field manual open in his lap, the same edition as the one they had destroyed, purchased from the base exchange at 11 the previous night. He had not turned a page in 40 minutes. Rafferty stood at the window beside Colt and looked at the same darkness. General Steck called at 0430. Your brother is alive, Sergeant. Phantom 6 has been on station for 3 hours. She's bought him time. A pause. She's been hit. Took some fragment damage, possibly reopened an existing wound. She has not left her position. Colt gripped the phone with both hands. Is she going to make it? I don't know. The general's voice was honest in a way that military voices rarely were. What I know is that she has not stopped. 40+ enemy casualties in 3 hours. She bought your brother 2 hours he didn't have. After the call ended, Colt set the phone on the window ledge and looked at his hands. Beckett had stopped cleaning the rifle. He was watching Colt with the careful attention of someone who understood that what he was witnessing mattered, that it should be witnessed properly. "She's wounded," Colt said. "She's wounded, and she's still there." Rafferty's forehead touched the cold glass of the window. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that was proportionate to what they had done and what she was doing in response to it. Dale closed the field manual. Outside Fort Caldwell was beginning its morning routine. Formations assembling, vehicles starting. The ordinary machinery of a military base moving through its ordinary processes, indifferent to the valley 8,000 miles away, where the math of survival was being worked out one round at a time by a woman none of them had known to see as anything other than the person in the corner booth with the field manual they had destroyed. Colt pressed his palm flat against the cold window glass and held it there. The sun was coming up over Kentucky. In Afghanistan, it was already up. And Mara Slade was still on the ridgeline, eye to the scope, doing the only thing that had ever truly mattered to her: the work. The sun came over the eastern mountains in a wash of cold gold that turned the Helmand Valley into something that looked for exactly the wrong moment like a painting. Mara did not look at it. She was counting heat signatures through the thermal optic, tracking the consolidation of enemy forces along the southern and western approaches to the compound. The reinforcements that had arrived in the 12 technicals 40 minutes ago had been absorbed into the existing force structure with a speed and discipline that told her something important about the command element she was dealing with. These were not men who panicked easily. They had been disrupted, and they had adapted, and now they were preparing to end this with the simple arithmetic of mass. 204 fighters. She had 311 rounds remaining. Her left shoulder had stopped bleeding, or had at least stopped bleeding enough to matter. The makeshift packing she had pressed into the wound was holding. The pain had settled into a consistent deep ache that she had incorporated into her physical awareness, the way she incorporated wind speed and ambient temperature as a variable to be accounted for rather than a problem to be solved. She keyed her radio. "Dagger 6, what is your current ammunition status?" Eli's voice came back immediately, clipped and controlled. 94 rounds total across all personnel, 14 wounded, 6 of them unable to engage. Effective fighting strength is 31 personnel. 94 rounds across 31 fighters against 204 enemy combatants preparing a coordinated assault from multiple directions. The math produced a single answer regardless of how many times she ran it. "Captain, I need every ranger who can still fire to be ready on my mark. When I give the word, I need all of them to fire one round straight up. Not at the enemy. Straight up." A pause. "That's nearly half our remaining ammunition." "I know exactly what it is, Captain. I need you to trust me." The pause this time was shorter. Whatever Eli Hargrove had witnessed in the past several hours had apparently been sufficient to establish a working definition of trust. "Copy, Phantom 6. Ready on your mark." She returned to the scope. The enemy commander, the man who had taken charge after she had disrupted the original command element, was moving along the line of his fighters with the unhurried authority of someone conducting a final inspection before a movement he considered inevitable. He was good at this. She had been watching him for 40 minutes, and he had not made a significant tactical error. He had pulled his forces back out of her effective engagement range, reorganized them into assault waves, positioned his crew-served weapons to suppress the compound during the initial push, and coordinated his timing so that the assault would come from 3 directions simultaneously. The only variable he had not accounted for was the one that could not be accounted for because it had never existed before in any engagement he had survived. Mara settled her breathing. The commander raised his hand, the signal that preceded the order to advance. "Mark," Mara said into the radio. 48 rifles fired into the Afghan sky. The sound that rose from the compound was the sound of a company-sized element, not a depleted platoon on its last ammunition. It was the sound of something with resources remaining, something with fight remaining, something that had not yet begun to consider the possibility of defeat. The enemy assault wave heard it and hesitated. Mara did not hesitate. The commander's 2 senior lieutenants died first, the men standing closest to him, the ones whose job it was to transmit his orders outward to the assault waves. 4 seconds between the first and second shot. Before either body had completed its fall, she had already acquired the 3rd target. a squad leader at the far left of the Western assault wave, identifiable by the way the men around him oriented to his position. One shot, the orientation dissolved. She worked left to right across the massed formation with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had done the calculations long before the moment arrived. Each shot was the result of a prioritization she had completed while the forces were still consolidating. Command and control elements first, crew-served weapons second, rally points third. The logic was simple: remove the structure and the mass becomes a crowd, and a crowd could be broken by things that would not break a formation. 11 shots in the first 90 seconds. The Western assault wave stopped moving forward. Then it began moving backward, and the movement backward was faster than the movement forward had been, because the mathematics of fear worked in the opposite direction from the mathematics of courage. She shifted to the southern wave. The crew-served weapon there, an RPG team with 3 launchers, had begun to orient toward her muzzle flashes. She took the team in 2 shots before the third launcher could be brought to bear. The southern wave fractured. The eastern approach held longest. The fighters there had better terrain cover and a more experienced leader, a man who was issuing instructions in a controlled voice and keeping his element together through the force of his personal presence. Mara watched him through the scope for approximately 4 seconds, which was the time required to confirm his function and make the calculation that determined how she would handle him. She aimed at his left shoulder. The round struck precisely where she aimed. He went down hard and did not get up immediately, but he was not dead, and in 30 seconds she could already see him attempting to rise, his right arm pushing against the ground while his left arm failed to cooperate. He would be wounded for weeks. He would have months of recovery in which to tell the story of what had happened in this valley. He would tell it to people who would tell it to other people, and the story would grow in the telling, the way such stories always did, until the single shooter on the ridgeline became something mythological, something that belonged to the category of things that could not be fought by conventional means. Fear was a weapon with a longer effective range than any rifle she had ever fired. The eastern wave broke. In the compound, Captain Eli Hargrove stood upright behind the parapet wall for the first time in 4 hours and watched 200 fighters become a routed mob, watched the vehicles that had brought them here start their engines and accelerate north with the urgency of men who had revised their estimate of how the morning was going to end. Sergeant First Class Aldridge appeared at his elbow. "Sir, they're running." "I can see that, Aldridge." "All of them, sir. Every single one." Eli keyed his radio. "Phantom 6. Enemy is in full retreat. What is your status?" The response came after a pause that was slightly longer than her previous responses. "Maintaining overwatch until your extraction is complete. What is your QRFETA?" "Apaches inbound 4 minutes. Ground forces 20 minutes behind them." "Copy. I'll be here." Aldridge was looking at Eli with the expression of a man who needed to say something that did not fit into any existing category of things that were said in after-action reports or unit histories or any of the official frameworks that military service provided for processing experience. "Sir, who is Phantom 6? Eli looked at the ridgeline to the east, at the dark rock against the brightening sky, at the place where nothing was visible, because nothing was meant to be visible. "I don't know," he said, "but I know what she did." The last helicopter left the compound at 0847 local time. Mara tracked it through her scope until it cleared the valley walls and disappeared into the morning sky, then held the position for another 4 minutes, watching the valley floor for any movement that suggested the retreat was a feint. It was not a feint. The vehicles were gone. The wounded who could move had been carried out. The dead had been left where they fell, which told her everything she needed to know about the completeness of the collapse. She lowered the rifle. For the first time in 11 hours and 14 minutes, she was not looking through a scope at something that required a decision. She looked at her hands. The right one was steady. The left one was trembling with a fine, persistent vibration that she recognized as the body's delayed accounting for what it had spent, the adrenaline debt coming due now that the immediate requirement for adrenaline had passed. She closed the left hand into a fist and held it until the trembling stopped, then opened it again. The shoulder was bleeding again. Not badly, but the makeshift packing had shifted during the final engagement, and the wound had reopened along one edge, and the left arm of her ghillie suit was wet in a way that was uncomfortable and would become more uncomfortable on the helicopter. She began breaking down her position with the same systematic care she had used to establish it. Spent casings collected and pocketed not because they mattered operationally, but because the habit of leaving nothing was older than her ability to remember acquiring it. Thermal decoy retrieved from the original position. Equipment accounted for in the reverse order of its deployment. Aaron Taft found her on the ridgeline at 0915, appearing from the northern end of the formation, with the careful movements of someone who had learned to announce himself clearly when approaching Mara Slade from an unexpected direction. He stopped 10 meters away and looked at the valley below, at the bodies and the burning vehicles and the debris field that marked where the enemy's assault had dissolved. He looked at this for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at her left arm. How bad? Fragment wound from a drone. Manageable. You've been up here for 11 hours. Closer to 12 now. She finished packing the rifle case and stood adjusting the weight across her shoulders and feeling the left shoulder's objection to the strap pressure. She accepted the objection and redistributed the load. Extraction. Helicopter is waiting on the ridge northern end, 30 minutes to Bagram. He fell into step beside her as she began moving. Mara, there are 48 Rangers alive right now who are going to be dead by dawn. I know. They're calling it a miracle. The QRF commander told Bagram Command it looked like a full special operations team had been running Overwatch. Nobody knows it was one person. Good. Aaron was quiet for a moment. The terrain required attention. She navigated it without looking at her feet, her eyes moving across the ground ahead with the automatic threat assessment habit that did not turn off. Does it bother you that they'll never know? Mara considered the question with the same honesty she applied to ballistic calculations. No. Why not? Because they're alive. That's the whole point. She stepped over a section of loose rock without breaking stride. The knowing is for them. The living is for me. The Bagram Air Base received her the way large military installations always received people who did not officially exist, with efficiency and without ceremony. A medical officer addressed the shoulder wound with the brisk competence of someone accustomed to treating injuries that were not supposed to have occurred in operations that were not supposed to have happened. 11 stitches. A week of antibiotics. Restricted lifting with the left arm. Colonel Briggs was waiting outside the medical bay with a vehicle and the expression of a man who had several things to say and was deciding which of them were necessary. He drove in silence for 2 minutes. 48, he said finally. Yes, sir. You were hit. Fragment wound. Non-critical. You operated alone for nearly 12 hours against a force of over 200 fighters with no support, no spotter, and a compromised shoulder. The shoulder wasn't compromised when I started. Briggs glanced at her with something that was not quite the expression she was used to seeing on his face. General Steck wants a full debrief when you're rested. He also wants to discuss the Phantom program's next training cohort. A pause. He believes the 4 Rangers from Gaines's Tavern are ready to begin evaluation. Mara looked out the window at the Bagram flight line, at the aircraft moving and the people moving and the machinery of a war that continued regardless of what any individual person did or did not accomplish within it. They failed the first test. They've spent 3 days proving they understand why. Briggs pulled up outside the billeting area. There's a difference between a person who has never been tested and a person who has failed a test and understood what the failure meant. The second type is sometimes more useful. She considered this. The debrief can wait 24 hours, he said. The rest cannot. That's an order, not a suggestion. She took the room key he offered. Sir, one question. Go ahead. The operation in Helmand, the ambush of Captain Hargrove's unit. She looked at him directly. Was any part of it designed? Briggs held her gaze for 3 seconds. The ambush was real. The casualties were real. The danger was real. A pause. What was observed was how people responded to it. That is a different thing. She absorbed this. And Gaines' Tavern. Observed. Not arranged. He met her eyes. You were never in any danger from those 4 men that you could not have ended in approximately 4 seconds. I know that. Then you know the observation was about them, not about you. He opened the driver's door. Sleep, Mara. The rest of this conversation will still be here tomorrow. She entered the room and set the rifle case in the corner with the careful placement of someone returning something valuable to its proper location. She sat on the edge of the bed and worked the left arm out of the jacket with slow movements that respected the stitches. Then she lay back and looked at the ceiling. 11 hours and 40 minutes of continuous engagement, 204 enemy combatants, 311 rounds expended, 48 Americans who would wake up tomorrow and the day after that. She closed her eyes. Sleep arrived like a physical weight, immediate and total. Fort Caldwell received her 3 days later with the indifference of a place that had never known she left. She walked off the transport in her logistics uniform with her gear bag over her right shoulder and the left shoulder moving with the careful economy of someone working around stitches, and no one looked twice. The logistics core patch on her BDU marked her as supply, as someone who had been somewhere administrative and returned from it as a person whose absence and return were equally unremarkable. She went directly to the warehouse. The paperwork that had accumulated in 3 days was substantial. Requisition forms, inventory discrepancies, equipment transfer requests that had stalled without her signature. She worked through it, standing at the tall desk near the back wall, moving from one form to the next with the systematic efficiency of someone clearing a sector. She was on the 43rd form when Briggs appeared in the doorway. She did not look up. "The 4 Rangers. Outside, they've been there for 40 minutes. He leaned against the doorframe. They came in dress uniform. She signed the 43rd form and picked up the 44th. "You said the observation was about them." "It was." "Then what they do next is also about them." She set down the pen. "Not about me." "No," Briggs agreed. "But you're the one who has to decide whether to give them the chance to demonstrate it." She looked at the stack of remaining forms. Then she picked up the pen, signed the remaining forms in sequence without reading them, stacked them in the outgoing tray, and walked to the door. The 4 of them stood at parade rest in the afternoon light outside the warehouse loading dock, dress uniforms correct in every detail, the kind of precision that required effort and therefore meant something. They came to attention when she appeared. The movement was simultaneous and instinctive. She stopped 6 feet away. Colt Hargrove spoke first. His voice had lost the particular quality it had carried in Gaines's Tavern, that weight of certainty that came from having never been genuinely wrong about something that mattered. What had replaced it was quieter and more considered. "Specialist Slade, we request permission to speak." She looked at each of them in turn. The assessment was the same one she had performed in the tavern, reading posture and micro-expression and the physical evidence of the days between. Colt had not been sleeping well. The tension around his eyes was the specific kind that came from thinking rather than from operational stress. Beckett Ashford held his left arm slightly away from his body, an unconscious acknowledgement of the shoulder she had identified and that he had since paid more attention to. Dale Pruitt was standing squarely on both feet with his weight equally distributed, the careful effort of someone who had decided to stop compensating. Rafferty Voss looked younger than he had in the tavern and older than he had at Ranger School, which was the correct direction to be moving. "You have 2 minutes," she said. Colt reached into his jacket and produced a small wooden box. He opened it and set it on the loading dock railing between them. Inside was a field manual, the same edition, the same technical specifications as the one that had been destroyed. And beneath it a challenge coin, its face engraved with the number 48 and 4 names. "Restitution first," he said. "The manual cost $87. We paid $870, because the point is not the money." She did not touch the box. She looked at it. Beckett spoke without the performance of his voice in the tavern, without the audience-aware quality that had shaped everything he said that night. "We judged a warrior by her cover. We saw someone quiet and called it weakness. We saw someone different and called it less." He stopped. The words had reached the edge of what words could carry. "My best friend's brother is alive because you chose to go anyway." Dale Pruitt said nothing. He reached into his jacket and produced the field manual he had been carrying for 3 days, the one from the base exchange, the one he had not turned a page of during the 40 minutes she had observed him through Briggs's report. He set it on top of the box. An addition to the restitution that had not been coordinated in advance. Rafferty Voss looked at her with the directness of someone who had decided that indirectness had cost enough. "I poured beer on your manual while you were preparing to go to Afghanistan alone. I didn't know that. It doesn't matter that I didn't know. I did it, and I need to say that clearly. He held her gaze. I'm sorry. Not because it's what I should say. Because I mean it. The afternoon light moved across the loading dock in the way it moved in October in Kentucky, low and specific and gold. Mara picked up the challenge coin and looked at it. The number 48 on one face, 4 names on the other, 3 words below the names, small and precise. We will earn this. She put it in her jacket pocket. Apology noted, she said, and accepted. She looked at Colt. Your brother lands tomorrow at 0800. Be there. Colt's throat moved. Did you know going in? Did you know he was my brother? I was told his name during the briefing. She looked at him steadily. It didn't change the mission parameters. Why did you go? After what we did? She considered how much of the answer was transferable to someone who had not yet learned what she had spent 6 years learning. Because warriors protect, she said. Not the people who deserve it, everyone. Even when it costs something. Even when no one will know your name. A pause. Especially then. She picked up the wooden box from the railing and turned toward the warehouse door. Specialist Slade? Rafferty's voice stopped her. If we apply for the Phantom program, will you train us? She did not turn around. The Phantom program doesn't accept applications. It identifies candidates. She resumed walking. Whether you're identified depends on whether you're worth identifying. That is entirely within your control. How do we make sure we are? She stopped at the door with her back to them. By being the soldiers you should have been 4 days ago, by treating every person in this uniform as potentially more than their patch suggests, by understanding that the work matters more than the recognition. She opened the door. And by being at that airfield at 0800 tomorrow, because whatever you owe me, you owe your brother more. She went back to her forms. Gaines's Tavern at 2100 hours looked exactly as it always looked, which was the point of places like this. The neon signs threw the same light. Roy Gaines worked the same end of the bar with the same cloth and the same pattern of motion. Walter Pruitt occupied the same corner table with the same amber glass. The 4 Rangers were in the corner booth when Mara walked in. She crossed the room without looking at anyone and sat down without being invited, and placed 4 envelopes on the table in a single motion that did not invite commentary on the gesture. Training begins at 0600 tomorrow. Report to the address on the orders inside. Bring nothing. Everything you need will be provided. She looked at each of them in turn. Everything you currently are will be examined, tested, and rebuilt from whatever survives the examination. There is no guarantee any of you will complete the program. There is no guarantee you will remember having attempted it if you do not. She paused. Questions? Colt looked at the envelope in front of him with the expression of someone who understood that opening it was a one-way door. All 4 of us. All 4. The program evaluates teams as well as individuals. What you are together may matter as much as what you are separately. Beckett picked up his envelope, set it down, picked it up again. What will you teach us? How to be invisible, how to be patient, how to make decisions at ranges where the consequences arrive before the sound does. She looked at the table. How to protect people who will never know your name. How to find meaning in work that produces no recognition and leaves no record. A pause. How to live with what the work costs. Roy Gaines set 4 fresh glasses on the table without being asked the quiet authority of a man who understood what was happening and considered it his particular privilege to witness it. Mara's phone vibrated. She looked at the screen. Colonel Briggs. She read the message, once stood, and slung the rifle bag from the chair back over her right shoulder with the practiced motion of someone who had been doing this for long enough that it no longer required thought. 0600, she said. She walked toward the door. Walter Pruitt raised his glass from the corner. He did not say anything. He had not said anything the last time either, just raised his glass toward the doorway, and the gesture meant the same thing now as it had then, which was that he recognized what he was looking at and considered it worth acknowledging. Mara did not see it. She was already through the door and moving through the Kentucky night toward whatever Briggs needed to tell her, her left shoulder aching with the steady reminder of stitches and the work they had closed her right hand, already reaching for the phone to confirm receipt of the message. Behind her in the tavern, 4 Rangers sat with 4 envelopes and 4 glasses. They were not drinking, and the particular silence of people who had arrived at the beginning of something they could not yet see the shape of. Roy Gaines polished the bar. The neon signs threw their light. The night outside was cold and clear and very dark, and somewhere in it a woman who did not officially exist was already thinking about the next mission, the next valley, the next set of impossible odds that would require someone to go in alone and come back or not come back, and either way, ensure that the people who needed protecting were protected. The work did not pause. Neither did she.